I didn't realize how dangerous a system becomes until I saw what happens when loyalty is no longer emotional but contractual. Because that is the moment power stops pretending to care and starts calculating. And this story begins on a morning that looked ordinary from the outside. Traffic moving slowly, coffee shops open, people scrolling their phones. While inside government buildings, a quiet reassessment was underway, because the numbers had finally stopped cooperating. Not catastrophically, not loudly, just enough to make denial impossible. And denial is always the first casualty when insiders stop believing their own talking points. And I was close enough to hear the tone change. The way conversations shifted from confidence to contingency. From this we'll pass to what if it doesn't? And that shift is subtle, but irreversible. Because once alternatives are discussed seriously, authority is already negotiating with reality, and reality never compromises. And what made this period especially unstable was that nothing was visibly wrong. There were no mass protests, no dramatic resignations, no external shocks large enough to justify panic, which meant the danger was internal, psychological. Because systems rely on shared belief as much as they rely on force, and belief was thinning, not disappearing. Just thinning enough to let doubt circulate, and doubt is far more corrosive than anger. Because anger can be directed, but doubt spreads randomly, infecting even those who think they are immune. And I watched how decision-makers began asking for second opinions they had never needed before. How approvals slowed, how minor issues escalated into long meetings. Because hesitation had entered the bloodstream. And hesitation signals weakness, even when it is rational. And once weakness is perceived, positioning begins, not openly, not conspiratorially, but pragmatically. Because people who have survived long enough learn that loyalty is safest when it aligns with self-preservation. And self-preservation always plans ahead. And the most unsettling part was how calm everyone appeared while doing it, because panic announces itself. But preparation hides behind routine, and routines continued. Schedules filled, statements released, while beneath it all, calculations were being updated. Because every system reaches a point where continuity becomes more important than direction, where maintaining motion matters more than deciding where to go. And that is when power becomes reactive, responding to pressure rather than shaping outcomes. And reaction invites opportunity for those who are patient enough to wait for missteps, and missteps became more frequent. Small at first, contradictory directives. Delayed responses, signals that should have been coordinated but weren't. And each inconsistency chipped away at the perception of inevitability. Because power's greatest asset is the belief that it cannot be replaced. And once replacement is imaginable, even abstractly, authority begins to negotiate rather than command. And negotiation is expensive because it requires concessions. And concessions invite more demands. And I remembered the exact moment when someone said, quietly, "This isn't about winning anymore," and no one argued. Because everyone understood that the goal had shifted to survival. And survival reframes every decision because it lowers standards. It tolerates compromises that would have been unthinkable before, and those compromises accumulate, slowly changing the character of the system. And the irony is that from the outside, this phase often looks stable. Because nothing explodes, nothing collapses, but inside it feels brittle, because everyone knows the structure is holding not because it is strong, but because it hasn't been tested properly yet. And untested structures invite testing because ambition smells opportunity the way fire smells oxygen. And ambition was returning cautiously at first, because long periods of stagnation create pent-up desire for movement. And movement always starts somewhere, often where attention is lowest. And that is why this story doesn't begin with a confrontation, but with a calculation. With individuals asking themselves not whether the system was right or wrong, but whether it could still protect them if things went wrong. Because protection is the true currency of loyalty. And the moment protection feels uncertain, allegiance becomes provisional. And provisional allegiance transforms institutions into marketplaces of influence, where support is traded for guarantees, and guarantees are fragile promises when resources are limited. And resources were indeed tightening, not enough to cause collapse, but enough to make generosity selective, and selectivity creates winners and losers inside any system. And losers don't disappear, they wait. And waiting is the most underestimated form of resistance. Because it looks like compliance until it suddenly isn't. And as I watched these dynamics unfold, it became clear that the next conflict would not be between the state and the public, but between different visions of continuity within the state itself. Because when power is no longer expanding, it turns inward, competing with itself, and that competition is rarely clean. Because it is fought through influence, access, timing, and information, not ideology. And once information becomes weaponized internally, trust collapses rapidly, because everyone starts assuming bad faith. And bad faith justifies preemption, and preemption accelerates conflict. And this is where the first chapter truly ends, not with an event, but with a condition. A system that is still standing, still functioning, but quietly preparing for something it refuses to name because naming it would force action. And action would expose positions too early, and in moments like this. The most dangerous thing is not what people are saying, but what they are silently getting ready to do. And in the next chapter, I'll tell you about the first move that broke the illusion of routine. The one that seemed minor at the time but changed the balance permanently, because once that move was made, there was no returning to the belief that time alone would keep everything together. The first move that shattered the illusion of routine didn't look like a move at all, which is why it worked, because it arrived wrapped in procedure, announced as a technical adjustment, a temporary measure, something so ordinary that most people barely registered it, and that was the genius of it. Because power rarely announces its intentions when it wants to succeed. It disguises them as maintenance, and I remember the room where the news was first discussed. Not loud, not tense, just uncomfortably quiet. Because everyone sensed that this adjustment was not about efficiency, but about signaling. About showing who could still act decisively when hesitation had become the norm. And what made it especially destabilizing was that it bypassed channels that had once been considered untouchable. Because bypassing is not just about speed, it's about hierarchy. And hierarchy is the language power speaks fluently. And suddenly people realized that certain protections they assumed were permanent were in fact conditional. And conditional protection changes behavior instantly. Because it forces recalculation, and recalculation breeds insecurity. And insecurity accelerates alignment, not toward principles, but toward whoever appears to be moving first. And I watched as people began adjusting their posture almost subconsciously. Choosing words more carefully, offering support more loudly than before. Because when uncertainty peaks, visibility becomes a shield, and silence becomes suspicious. And this shift didn't happen because people believed in the move, but because they feared being associated with resistance to it. Because resistance implies confidence in alternatives, and alternatives were still too abstract to risk openly. And the move also did something else, something more subtle and more dangerous. It exposed divisions that had been manageable when everything was theoretical. Because once action replaces speculation, people are forced to choose sides. Even if they don't admit it to themselves, and choices once made harden quickly. Because reversing them carries social and political costs. And that is how escalation begins, not with confrontation, but with commitment. And I saw how alliances that once felt natural began to strain. Because they were built on shared patience rather than shared strategy. And patience had run out unevenly, and those who moved quickly gained temporary advantage. Not because they were stronger, but because they were clearer. And clarity is intoxicating in periods of drift. Because it offers relief from ambiguity, and ambiguity had exhausted everyone. And as clarity consolidated around this new line, those who hesitated found themselves increasingly isolated, not attacked, just ignored. And being ignored inside a system is more dangerous than being opposed, because opposition can rally. But neglect suffocates, and suffocation is quiet. And quiet changes the rhythm of power because it reduces the number of voices that matter. And fewer voices mean faster decisions, and faster decisions create momentum. And momentum is difficult to stop once it builds, and this is where the second phase began. The phase where reactions replaced deliberation because every move now demanded a response. And responses reveal intent, and intent exposes vulnerability. And vulnerability invites pressure, and pressure narrows options further. And the system entered a spiral that felt controlled but wasn't. Because control based on reaction is fragile, and fragility demands constant reinforcement. And reinforcement consumes resources, trust, and time, all of which were already in short supply, and the economic strain made this worse. Because material constraints remove the cushion that allows political mistakes to be absorbed quietly, and mistakes began to echo louder than before. Not in public, but internally, where confidence matters most. And I remember someone saying, half joking, "We're moving too fast now," and the response was silence. Because speed had become the only proof of authority left, and slowing down would have signaled doubt, and doubt at that stage was dangerous. Because it would have invited countermoves, and countermoves would have exposed just how fragile the alignment really was. And so the system pushed forward, driven not by strategy, but by fear of appearing weak. And that fear distorted judgment, because it framed every decision as existential. And when everything is existential, compromise becomes betrayal. And once compromise is off the table, outcomes become binary: win or lose, control or collapse. And that binary thinking narrowed the future dramatically, because it eliminated middle paths that might have absorbed tension gradually, and instead set the stage for a decisive moment that could not be postponed indefinitely. Because momentum demands resolution, and unresolved momentum becomes chaos. And chaos was the one thing everyone claimed to be preventing, even as their actions made it more likely. And by the end of this phase, it was clear to those paying attention that the system had crossed a threshold. Because it was no longer drifting, it was accelerating. An acceleration in a constrained environment always leads to impact. The only question is where, and in the next chapter, I'll tell you about the moment when acceleration met resistance. When a single countermove forced every hidden calculation into the open, and why that moment marked the point of no return, not because it caused immediate collapse, but because it permanently changed how power could operate from that day forward. The countermove that finally ended the illusion of control arrived not as an attack, but as a refusal. And refusals are far more destabilizing than confrontation because they deny power the reaction it expects. And when the refusal came, it was quiet, procedural, and devastatingly precise. Because a decision that should have been executed simply wasn't, not delayed, not negotiated, just not carried out. And in systems built on momentum, interruption is a shock, because everything depends on continuity. And the first response was disbelief, followed by irritation. And then something more dangerous, calculation. Because calculation means power is no longer certain of its position. And I remember the hours that followed, how messages were sent and unanswered, how explanations were requested and came back vague, how authority began to sound like persuasion without admitting it. Because once orders require explanation, hierarchy has already slipped. And the refusal did not spread immediately. It didn't need to. Because its existence alone introduced possibility. And possibility is corrosive to systems that rely on inevitability. Because inevitability is what keeps people aligned when they are tired, afraid, or unconvinced. And once inevitability cracks, alignment becomes conditional. And conditional alignment collapses under pressure, and pressure arrived quickly. Because the system could not tolerate ambiguity at that stage. Not after accelerating, not after consolidating. Not after signaling that hesitation was no longer acceptable. And so it pushed back, expecting compliance to snap into place, as it always had. But this time the response was uneven. Some complied instantly, others complied loudly, and a few complied strategically, which meant they appeared aligned while quietly preparing alternatives. And those alternatives multiplied silently. Because once people see that refusal does not immediately result in annihilation, they begin to imagine their own limits. And limits are the boundaries power fears most, because they cannot be erased by decree. And this is where the final phase began. Not a collapse, not a victory, but a reckoning with the consequences of having narrowed the system too far. Because consolidation had removed buffers. intermediaries, and redundancies. And when pressure met resistance, there was nowhere for the shock to dissipate. And instead, it ricocheted through the structure, amplifying stress everywhere. And stress reveals fault lines that have been hidden by routine. And routines broke down quickly, meetings were called and canceled. Decisions were reversed and reissued. Narratives shifted too fast to be believable. Because speed without coherence looks like panic. And panic invites challenge even when people are not ready to lead it. And the most dangerous realization for those at the center is that force alone could not solve the problem without creating a larger one. Because force would confirm the very fears that had produced the refusal in the first place. And so power hesitated, and that hesitation was noticed. Because after months of acceleration, any pause felt unnatural. And unnatural pauses attract attention, and attention concentrates risk. And inside the system, everyone began watching everyone else. Because when outcomes are uncertain, information becomes the most valuable asset. And information hoarding replaced cooperation almost overnight. Because cooperation assumes shared futures, and shared futures were no longer guaranteed. And I saw how trust evaporated not through betrayal, but through silence. Because silence allows imagination to do the damage that facts cannot. And imagination in political systems is lethal, because it fills gaps with worst-case scenarios. And worst-case scenarios justify preemptive action. And preemptive action fragments systems faster than any external shock. And fragmentation does not look like chaos at first. It looks like specialization, like compartments tightening, like roles becoming narrowly defined, because people seek safety and clarity when the larger picture becomes unstable. And that clarity came at a cost, because it reduced the system's ability to adapt. And adaptation was exactly what the moment demanded. And this is the paradox that defines the ending. That the strategies which had ensured survival now prevented resolution. Because survival had been achieved through control, and control had eliminated flexibility. And without flexibility, every response became extreme. Either too much or too little, never enough. And the refusal forced that contradiction into the open, because it could not be ignored. And it could not be punished decisively without triggering wider consequences, and so the system stalled. Not visibly, not publicly, but internally, because it had run out of moves that did not carry unacceptable risk. And that is when the narrative of inevitability finally died. Because inevitability requires motion, and motion had stopped. And what replaced it was endurance without direction. A state where everything continues, because stopping would expose failure. But moving forward would require choices that no one was willing to own. And endurance without direction is exhausting. Because it consumes resources without producing progress, and exhaustion changes priorities. Because exhausted systems prioritize stability over ambition, predictability over innovation. And that shift was felt everywhere, in policy and tone. In the unspoken understanding that the era of expansion was over, replaced by maintenance. And maintenance is not inspiring. It does not generate loyalty. It generates compliance at best, and compliance is fragile, because it depends on constant reinforcement, and reinforcement is expensive, and costs accumulated relentlessly, not always economically, but socially, institutionally, psychologically, because people began planning lives around permanence rather than possibility, around endurance rather than growth, and that planning locked the future into a narrow corridor. And corridors feel safe until you realize there is no exit. And I remember thinking that the true ending had already occurred quietly. When the system chose to protect itself rather than redefine itself, because that choice foreclosed alternatives that might have been painful but transformative, and instead committed everything to preservation. And preservation always privileges the present over the future. And that is why the final outcome feels unresolved rather than concluded, because nothing ended dramatically, nothing collapsed, nothing triumphed. The system simply settled into a hardened shape, one that could withstand shocks, but could not absorb change. And that shape defined everything that followed. Because once a system internalizes fear of disruption, it designs every response to minimize risk rather than maximize possibility, and risk avoidance becomes identity. and identity resists challenge more effectively than any policy ever could. And so the story ends not with answers, but with clarity. Clarity about how power behaves when pushed beyond persuasion. Clarity about how survival strategies become permanent architectures. And clarity about the cost of choosing control over adaptability, because that cost is not paid once. It is paid continuously, in missed opportunities, in deferred futures. In a society trained to endure rather than imagine, and that is the quiet ending to a story that never announced its conclusion. Because the most decisive moments rarely do, they simply pass, unnoticed by those waiting for spectacle, while quietly reshaping everything beneath them. And by the time anyone asks whether it could have ended differently, the answer has already been built into the structure itself.